The monitors flatlined. The most feared mob boss in Chicago was declared dead, his empire left to vultures. But they didn't count on Matilda, an overweight, overlooked maid who refused to let him go. What happened behind those locked doors that night defied every medical textbook in existence. Gabriel Falcone was not a man who commanded respect. He extracted it. At 34, he was the undisputed head of the Chicago Syndicate, running an empire that stretched from the docks of Lake Michigan to the back rooms of the city's highest political offices. He wore custom Brioni suits, calculated his moves with cold precision, and possessed a stare that could freeze the blood of the most hardened criminals. In the sprawling, heavily fortified Falcone estate, located in the exclusive enclave of Highland Park, there were dozens of staff members. Among them was Matilda Higgins. Matilda was a 26-year-old maid, and she was invisible. Or rather, she was hyper-visible, but entirely ignored. Standing 5'4" and weighing close to 280 pounds, she was heavily overweight, a fact she was painfully aware of every second of the day. The other maids, sleek and gossipy, relegated her to the heaviest, most grueling tasks. The cartel soldiers who loitered in the kitchen mocked her openly, calling her names under their breath as she scrubbed the marble floors until her broad shoulders ached. But Gabriel Falcone never mocked her. 3 months prior, an arrogant underboss named Carmine Rossi had intentionally tripped Matilda in the grand foyer. She had fallen hard, her heavy frame crashing against the imported Italian tiles, shattering a tray of crystal glasses. As Carmine and his men erupted into cruel laughter, Gabriel had walked into the room. The laughter died instantly. Gabriel didn't yell. He simply looked at Carmine, his voice a low, lethal murmur. "If you ever disrespect the people who keep my house standing again, Carmine, I'll have you cleaning these floors with your tongue. Pick her up, apologize." Since that day, Matilda harbored a fierce, unwavering loyalty to the Mafia boss. She knew what he was, a criminal, a killer, but in her world of constant humiliation, he was the only person who had ever demanded she be treated like a human being. On a freezing Tuesday night in November, the illusion of Gabriel's invincibility shattered. It was an inside job. During a routine meeting at a warehouse in the West Loop, Gabriel was ambushed. The crossfire was chaotic, orchestrated by the rival Corsican faction, but the doors were unlocked from the inside by one of his own. Gabriel took 3 bullets, 2 to the abdomen and 1 that grazed his chest, dangerously close to his heart. The estate was thrown into absolute pandemonium when the black SUVs roared up the driveway, their tires tearing up the manicured lawns. Cartel soldiers dragged Gabriel's bleeding body into the East Wing, a section of the mansion outfitted as a state-of-the-art underground trauma center. Dr. Harrison Mitchell, a disgraced former chief of surgery at Johns Hopkins, who now made millions patching up the underworld, was already waiting, gloves snapped on. Matilda watched from the shadows of the pantry, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the sheer volume of blood soaking through Gabriel's white dress shirt. The medical bay doors slammed shut. For 2 agonizing hours, the mansion held its breath. Carmine Rossi paced the hallway, surrounded by loyalists, already beginning to whisper about succession, territories, and who would control the offshore accounts in the Caymans. Inside the surgical suite, Dr. Mitchell was losing the battle. "His blood pressure is plummeting. Push another milligram of epinephrine," Dr. Mitchell barked at his assistant. "Doctor, it's not just the blood loss," the assistant panicked, staring at the monitors. "The blood, it's not clotting right, and his core temperature is dropping abnormally fast. It's a neurotoxin. The bullets were laced. Mitchell swore violently. It was a cocktail of synthetic tetrodotoxin, a lethal paralytic poison, mixed with a heavy sedative, likely engineered in an underground lab. It was designed not just to kill, but to shut down the central nervous system entirely, masking the exact moment of death. Charging defibrillator to 200 joules. Clear! Gabriel's body convulsed on the steel table, but the monitor remained a jagged, relentless flatline. 300! Clear! Nothing. The high-pitched, continuous drone of the electrocardiogram echoed off the sterile white walls. Mitchell checked Gabriel's pupils with a penlight, fixed and dilated. His skin had already taken on the waxy, pale pallor of a corpse. He felt for a pulse at the carotid artery. There was zero resistance, zero flow. At 11:42 p.m., Dr. Mitchell pulled off his blood-soaked surgical mask. He looked at the clock on the wall, his face grim. Time of death, 11:42. Pack him up. I have to go tell the wolves outside. The medical staff disconnected the IVs, pulled a heavy white sheet over Gabriel Falcone's face, and turned the air conditioning down to 50 degrees to preserve the body until the discreet mortuary team arrived at dawn. When Dr. Mitchell stepped out of the doors and delivered the news, the mansion erupted. Not in grief, but in treacherous ambition. Carmine Rossi immediately assumed command, shouting orders, dispatching men to secure the armories, and demanding the estate be locked down. Gabriel's body was abandoned in the freezing medical wing, instantly forgotten by the men who had sworn their lives to him, now too busy fighting over his throne. By 2 a.m., the mansion was a war room of cigarette smoke, whiskey, and shouting men. The guards posted outside the east wing had abandoned their posts to join the power struggle in the main dining hall. Matilda slipped out of the kitchen. She was wearing her oversized grey uniform, her face streaked with silent tears. She couldn't believe it. The man who had stood up for her, the man who possessed more life and terrifying energy than anyone she had ever met, couldn't just be gone. Her heavy footsteps made no sound on the thick carpets as she navigated the familiar, darkened hallways. She reached the medical wing. The heavy metal doors were unlocked. When she stepped inside, the blast of frigid air hit her instantly. The room felt like a meat locker. In the center of the room, under the stark, unforgiving fluorescent lights, lay the body of Gabriel Falcone, shrouded in a white sheet. Matilda approached the steel table, her large hands trembling. She gently pulled the sheet back. Gabriel looked like a marble statue. His lips were slightly blue, his skin icy to the touch. The trauma team had bandaged his wounds, but they had left his chest bare. A sob tore through Matilda's throat. "You can't be dead," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You're too strong for them. You don't get to die like this, left all alone in the cold." She placed her hand on his chest. It was freezing. The neurotoxin, combined with the extreme drop in room temperature, was rapidly freezing his tissues. He shouldn't be this cold, Matilda thought, her maternal instincts warring with the finality of the flat-lined monitors still sitting dormant in the corner. Nobody should leave this world freezing in a steel room. Driven by a desperate, illogical surge of grief, Matilda did the unthinkable. She climbed up onto the heavy surgical bed. The metal groaned slightly under her substantial weight. She lay down beside him, maneuvering her large, soft body so that she was pressed entirely against his side. She threw one heavy leg over his, draped her thick arm across his bandaged torso, and tucked his freezing face against her plump, fleshy neck. Matilda was a large woman, and with that mass came a tremendous amount of natural body heat. She was a living, breathing furnace. She wrapped herself around him like a heavy, heated, weighted blanket, sandwiching him between her soft curves and the mattress, minimizing his exposure to the freezing air of the room. Tears streamed down her chubby cheeks, soaking into his dark hair. "I'm here, Mr. Falcone. I'm right here. I won't let you be cold." An hour passed. Then 2. Matilda's muscles cramped, and her body ached from the awkward positioning on the narrow table, but she refused to let go. Her sheer bulk was insulating him. The ambient temperature of her body, running hot at 99 degrees due to her distress, was slowly bleeding into his icy flesh. Around 4:15 a.m., Matilda shifted her weight. As her large chest pressed firmly against his bare sternum, she paused. She frowned, holding her breath. She pressed her ear flat against his chest, right over his heart, squishing her cheek against his cold skin. Silence. Then, a sound so faint she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. Thump. It was weak. It was incredibly slow. A full 60 seconds passed in agonizing silence. Thump. Matilda gasped, her eyes flying open. She remembered a medical show she had watched while ironing linens. Extreme hypothermia can mimic death. Toxins can slow the heart to a crawl. He wasn't dead. The poison had essentially put him into a state of suspended animation, slowing his heart rate to 1 beat per minute, undetectable by a standard pulse check, and easily missed by machines if the voltage drops too low. But the freezing room was going to kill him for real if his blood didn't start moving. Panic and adrenaline surged through Matilda's heavy frame. She couldn't yell for help. Carmine Rossi's men would likely finish the job if they knew the boss was still breathing. She had to keep him warm. She had to keep his blood pumping. Matilda straddled his hips, her heavy thighs anchoring him down. She placed her large, strong hands calloused from years of scrubbing stone floors, over the center of his chest. She threw her considerable upper body weight into a chest compression. The force of her bulk pressing down compressed his chest cavity deeply. She released, then pushed again. 1, 2, 3, 4. She wasn't doing full CPR. He was faintly breathing on his own, a shallow gasp every 2 minutes. She was acting as a mechanical pump for his sluggish heart, forcing the warmed blood from his core, heated by her own massive body, out to his extremities. The physical exertion was immense. Within 10 minutes, Matilda was drenched in sweat. Her uniform clung to the rolls of her stomach, her arms burned with lactic acid, and she was panting heavily. But every time she wanted to stop, she looked at Gabriel's face, remembering the day he had saved her dignity in the foyer. "Come on, boss," she grunted, tears and sweat dripping from her chin onto his pale chest. "Breathe. You have to breathe." She alternated between aggressive, weight-driven compressions and violently rubbing his arms and legs with her thick hands, generating intense friction. She laid her heavy, boiling hot body over him during her breaks to transfer every ounce of heat she could muster, essentially incubating him. By 5:30 a.m., the blue tint had vanished from Gabriel's lips. By 5:50 a.m., Matilda felt a distinct, steady flutter beneath her palm. His heart was speeding up, fighting off the paralytic effects of the poison as the heat broke down the synthetic compounds in his bloodstream. At 6 a.m. sharp, the heavy metal doors to the medical bay hissed open. Carmine Rossi strode in, a smug, triumphant smirk on his face, flanked by Dr. Mitchell, holding a black body bag. "All right, Doc. Zip him up and let's get him out the back before the feds." Carmine's voice caught in his throat. The sight before them defied logic. The obese maid, drenched in sweat, her hair wild, was sitting atop the supposedly dead Mafia boss, clutching his shoulders. Before Carmine could draw his weapon, Gabriel Falcone's back arched off the steel table. A loud, ragged gasp tore from Gabriel's lungs, echoing like a gunshot in the sterile room. His chest heaved violently, sucking in massive amounts of oxygen. His eyelids snapped open, revealing eyes that were bloodshot, furious, and terrifyingly alive. Gabriel turned his head slowly, his lethal gaze locking directly onto a paralyzed Carmine Rossi. You're dead," Carmine whispered, taking a stumbling step backward. Gabriel coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and looked up at the exhausted, heavy-set maid who was still protectively hovering over his chest. He reached up, his hand trembling slightly, and placed it over Matilda's hand. "Not anymore," Gabriel rasped, his voice a graveyard whisper that made the blood run cold in Carmine's veins. For a fraction of a second, the surgical suite was paralyzed in a tableau of absolute horror. Carmine Rossi stared at the steel table, his mind violently rejecting the impossible reality before him. The monitors were still dead. The room was a freezing 35 degrees, and yet Gabriel Falcone was sitting up, breathing, and looking at him with the promise of utter destruction. Dr. Harrison Mitchell dropped the heavy black body bag. It hit the linoleum floor with a sickening thud. "Kill him!" Carmine shrieked, his voice cracking an octave higher as panic finally shattered his shock. His hand flew inside his tailored suit jacket, his fingers frantically closing around the grip of his suppressed 9mm pistol. "He's weak. He's unarmed. Shoot him, Mitchell." But the disgraced doctor was frozen, pressed flat against the medical cabinets, trembling violently. Gabriel's muscles screamed in agony. The synthetic neurotoxin still coated his nerve endings, making his limbs feel like they were encased in wet cement. He tried to swing his legs off the table, but his body betrayed him. He was completely defenseless. Carmine drew his weapon, raising the barrel directly at Gabriel's chest. "You should have stayed dead, boss." Before Carmine could pull the trigger, a guttural, terrifying roar echoed through the room. It wasn't Gabriel, Matilda Higgins, running on pure, unadulterated adrenaline and primal protective instinct, launched herself off the surgical table. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the gun or the danger. She only saw the man who had treated her like a human being about to be murdered. All 280 pounds of her slammed directly into Carmine Rossi's chest. The physics of the collision were catastrophic for the treacherous underboss. Carmine, a lean and wiry man who relied on intimidation rather than raw strength, had no time to brace himself. Matilda's massive, soft body acted like a fleshy battering ram. The impact lifted Carmine completely off his feet. The gun discharged wildly into the ceiling, raining plaster down upon them as they crashed backward. They smashed into a towering glass cabinet of surgical supplies. The heavy glass shattered outward in a spectacular explosion of crystal shards, syringes, and saline bags. Carmine hit the floor hard, the breath completely knocked from his lungs. But Matilda didn't stop. She descended upon him with the full weight of her heavy frame, pinning his chest to the cracked linoleum. She grabbed his gun wrist with both of her thick, calloused hands, slamming it against the floor with terrifying, desperate force until his fingers spasmed and released the weapon. It skittered across the floor, coming to a halt near the metal leg of the surgical table. "Get off me, you fat cow!" Carmine wheezed, his face turning purple as he struggled beneath her immense bulk. He punched wildly at her ribs, his fists sinking into her soft flesh, but Matilda gritted her teeth, ignoring the stinging pain. She drove her heavy knees into his shoulders, effectively trapping him. Gabriel watched the entire brutal spectacle, his chest heaving. A dark, terrifying smirk slowly stretched across his pale face. "Mitchell," Gabriel rasped, his voice vibrating with lethal authority. Dr. Mitchell flinched. "Pick up the gun, Harrison. Kick it to me, now." Mitchell, realizing exactly which way the wind had just violently shifted, scrambled on his hands and knees. He scooped up the suppressed pistol and slid it across the floor. Gabriel's hand was shaking as he gripped the weapon, but his aim was dead center. He leveled the barrel at the struggling traitor beneath the maid. "Matilda," Gabriel said, his voice softening just a fraction, a stark contrast to the cold steel in his eyes. "Get up, sweetheart. You've done enough." Panting, her uniform torn and covered in Carmine's blood and shattered glass, Matilda slowly pushed her heavy body off the underboss, stumbling backward. Carmine gasped for air, clutching his bruised ribs as he tried to push himself up. He looked down the barrel of his own gun, straight into Gabriel's unblinking eyes. "Gabriel, wait, please, it was the Corsicans. They made me do it," Carmine begged, holding his hands up. "You unlocked my doors, Carmine," Gabriel whispered, the coldness in his tone dropping the temperature of the room even further. "And then you insulted my nurse." Pfft, pfft. Two suppressed shots echoed quietly in the medical bay. Carmine Rossi slumped backward into the broken glass, a dark pool of crimson expanding rapidly beneath him. He didn't move again. Gabriel lowered the weapon, his breathing ragged. He looked over at Mitchell. "Bring me a phone. Then fix my bandages. If I bleed out now, I swear to God, Harrison, I'll wait for you in hell." 10 minutes later, Gabriel made a single, raspy phone call to Lorenzo and Dominic, two captains in the syndicate whose loyalty was unquestionable, primarily because they hated Carmine Rossi. When the heavy doors to the medical bay opened again, Lorenzo and his heavily armed crew swept in. They took one look at the resurrected boss sitting on the table and the bleeding corpse of Carmine on the floor, and immediately dropped their eyes in absolute submission. "Clean this up," Gabriel ordered, his voice growing stronger by the minute as the heat returned to his blood. "Lock down the estate. Any man who swore loyalty to Carmine in the last 6 hours is to be taken to the docks and drowned. No exceptions." "Yes, boss," Lorenzo nodded instantly. "And Lorenzo," Gabriel added, gesturing with a bloody hand toward the corner of the room. There, shivering violently as the adrenaline left her system, stood Matilda. She had wrapped her thick arms around her large stomach, looking down at her scuffed shoes, terrified that she had overstepped her boundaries. She was just a maid, and she had just assaulted a Mafia underboss. "Prepare the master suite," Gabriel commanded, his dark eyes never leaving Matilda's face. "And tell the staff that Matilda no longer scrubs floors. From this second forward, you sound out to She answers to absolutely no one in this city, except me." 3 weeks later, the Chicago syndicate had been brutally, surgically purged. Gabriel Falcone's near-death experience had triggered a wave of terrifying retribution. Rival factions were decimated, traitors were buried in concrete, and the Falcone empire emerged from the ashes twice as violent and completely untouchable. Whispers ran through the criminal underworld about the boss who had literally conquered death, a dark mythos that made Gabriel more feared than ever before. But inside the heavily guarded Highland Park estate, a different kind of transformation had taken place. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Inside the sprawling master suite, a cavernous room of dark mahogany, velvet curtains and a roaring fireplace, Matilda stood awkwardly in front of a floor-to-ceiling mirror. She was no longer wearing the rough, oversized grey uniform. Instead, she wore a custom-tailored, emerald-green silk-wrap dress. It draped elegantly over her wide hips and heavy thighs, plunging slightly to flatter her large bust. The mansion's private stylists had styled her hair into soft, cascading waves and applied subtle makeup that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes. Yet as she looked at her reflection, Matilda's shoulders slumped. She still saw the fat, invisible girl. She saw the soft, rolling flesh of her stomach, the thickness of her arms, the double chin she constantly tried to hide. She felt like an imposter playing dress-up in a dead king's castle. "You're frowning." Gabriel stepped out of the adjoining study. He was walking with a slight limp, leaning lightly on an ebony cane, but otherwise he looked like a god of war. He wore black slacks and a black dress shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. He walked slowly across the thick Persian rug, his eyes locked onto her reflection in the glass. "I look ridiculous, Mr. Falcone," Matilda whispered, looking down at her manicured hands. I'm too big for clothes like this. I look like a stuffed sausage. The staff, they look at me in the hallways. I know what they're thinking." Gabriel stopped directly behind her. He didn't hover. He pressed his body firmly against her broad back, wrapping his arms around her thick waist. He rested his chin on her shoulder, looking at their joined reflection. "First of all, my name is Gabriel," he said, his voice a low, soothing rumble against her neck. "Second, if anyone on this staff so much as looks at you with anything less than absolute worship, Lorenzo will remove their eyes. I told you that." "But they're right to stare," she argued, tears pricking her eyes. "Gabriel, look at me. I'm fat. I'm plain. I'm a maid. Men like you, men with empires, you don't keep women like me in the master suite. You're supposed to have a supermodel, someone thin, someone beautiful." Gabriel turned her around forcibly, but gently. He dropped his cane, letting it clatter to the floor, so he could cup her large, soft cheeks with both of his hands. His dark eyes were fierce, burning with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "Listen to me very carefully, Matilda," Gabriel commanded, his thumbs brushing away a stray tear from her cheek. "I have lived in a world of beautiful, thin, treacherous snakes my entire life. They are hollow. They are cold. When the bullets hit my chest, those beautiful people left me in a freezing room to die so they could steal my money." He stepped closer, pressing his chest against hers. "You think your size is a flaw? Your body is the only reason my heart is beating right now. You climbed onto that freezing steel table, and you wrapped me in your heat. You pumped the blood through my veins with your bare hands. You used your weight to crush a man who was trying to put a bullet in my brain." Gabriel lowered his head, his lips hovering mere millimeters from hers. "I don't want a fragile porcelain doll, Matilda. I want the woman who dragged me back from the grave. I want your warmth. I want your strength. I want exactly how soft you are, because you are the only real thing in my entirely synthetic world." A sob tore from Matilda's throat as the years of deep-seated insecurities, the cruel taunts, and the feeling of invisibility shattered under the sheer weight of his conviction. Gabriel closed the distance, pressing his lips to hers. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It was possessing, consuming, and deeply reverent. He kissed her like a starving man who had finally found sustenance. Matilda's heavy arms came up, wrapping around his broad shoulders, pulling him flush against her curves. For the first time in her life, she didn't try to suck in her stomach or hide her bulk. She let him feel all of her, and Gabriel groaned into the kiss, his hands sliding down to grip her wide hips with possessive force. Over the next year, the legend of Gabriel Falcone evolved, but it was no longer just about his ruthlessness. It was about the untouchable Queen of Chicago. Matilda Falcone never lost her size, and she never lost her compassion, but she shed her invisibility entirely. She sat beside Gabriel at the head of the long mahogany table during syndicate negotiations, her presence a silent, heavy reminder of loyalty. Cartel bosses from New York to Las Vegas learned very quickly that to disrespect the boss's heavy-set wife was a guaranteed death sentence. She managed the legitimate fronts of the empire, funding hospitals and taking a quiet, aggressive pleasure in entirely buying out Dr. Harrison Mitchell's medical license, ensuring he never practiced medicine again. And every night, when the doors of the master suite locked, the most feared mobster in America surrendered his weapons, his empire, and his armor. He would bury his face in the soft, warm curve of his wife's neck, breathing in her scent, finding his absolute peace in the protective embrace of the woman who had refused to let him go cold into the dark. Did this heart-pounding Mafia romance leave you breathless? If you loved watching Matilda rise from overlooked maid to the untouchable Queen of Chicago, hit that like button right now. Share this incredible story of loyalty, survival, and unexpected love with your friends who crave real drama. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss out on our thrilling audio stories. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite twist?